Hi everyone, welcome to the fifth lecture in our series for professionalism, leadership and management in early childhood. In the past few weeks, we've focused mainly on the context of being in a school as a teacher and what those legal and professional responsibilities are. From now on, we're going to turn our attention to the early childhood education and care sector, and specifically childcare centres, whether they are family daycare or long daycare, and we'll talk about each of those in turn. It's important to understand many of the same legal responsibilities apply in childcare settings to schools, and in some ways they're even under a greater deal more scrutiny by various authorities. On the agenda for today is a general overview of the current state of early childhood education and care in Australia. Among that, there will be some resources, some statistics, a little bit of a look at workforce composition and qualifications. Then we're going to dive into some of the organisational elements of Australian ECEC, those being the National Quality Framework and the components of that. The resource, which is the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority, often referred to as ASEQA or ASEQA. And then we're going to unpack the different types of early childhood education and care that you will have come across. And the final part of today's lecture is looking a little bit more deeply at what is that role of educational leadership in early childhood education and care, and unpacking and distinguishing what leadership is from the importance of what management is. Over the past 5 to 10 years, in recent years, there has been a series of significant reforms to early childhood education and care and the standard of service provision that's been provided nationally. So we're going to have a little look now just at what some of those reforms have been and what's been the impact of those reforms. There was recognised that there was a need for a much more consistent set of standards across the nation for service provision. So we know that major reform to be what we refer to as the National Quality Standards, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides' time, and you may already be familiar with. There was also the need for some sort of rating system that provided parents with important information about the services that their children receive. It's also important from a staffing perspective that everybody understands what is a quality service and what is a service that requires more intervention to become a higher quality. There was also a need for a more streamlined regulatory arrangement that improved this consistency and started to reduce the individual administrative or sort of ad hoc burden on individual service providers. So we're going to be talking about the Education Department of Communities a little bit later on today, and have a look at how their regulatory system actually operates to be able to help streamline some of that administrative work. And of course, there was the development and implementation of two frameworks, specifically the Early Years Learning Framework and the other one being My Time, Our Place, that guides our practice as educators to support quality teaching and learning. The main differences that you'll see with these reforms as recently as 2021 is a stronger connection between the frameworks and the NQS, the National Quality Standard, in specific areas like transitions, sustainability, theoretical approaches to learning and care, more support for staff in terms of improving critical reflection practices, the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of being and knowing and doing, a lot more evidence of inclusion being practiced, and of course the addition of new principles over time. So I mentioned previously ASEQA. So this is, of course, the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority, and they represent the national authority who is responsible for guiding both the implementation and the ongoing administration of the NQF, the National Quality Framework, across the country. They do provide oversight of the NQS and how it's applied across the country so that services are meeting their requirements. They do monitor and promote consistent application of the Education and Care Services National Law, which we'll talk about shortly, and they also oversee how the NQS is applied. ASEQA's board reports directly to the Ministerial Council, who's responsible for early childhood. If you're able to, I encourage you now just to hit pause and head to that website. You can simply Google ACECQA or follow that particular URL there. I want you just to have a little bit of a 5 to 10 minute play around if you've never been to the ASEQA website before. Some of it you will need to become familiar with over time, particularly things like the national quality standards. And you may also like to have a little bit of a sneak peek at, there's a tab there all about the rating and assessment process. So hit pause when you're ready, go and visit that website, have a little peruse, and then when you're ready, come back to the lecture. You may already be getting just a little bit confused about the acronyms that I have been using: NQF, NQS, rating and assessment. How does all of this fit together? The way to understand it is the NQF, the National Quality Framework, is the overarching group of these 4 elements that you can see on your screen. So among the framework, we do have a law, the regulations, the standard, and a process of rating and assessment. Each of those 4 comes together to obviously comprise the framework, and it's important that we don't confuse the NQS from the NQF. So if you hear NQF, just think, okay, this is the overall overarching framework of all 4 of these aspects. Throughout this course, you will be exposed to all 4 of these. And in fact, your second assessment is entirely about the National Quality Standard. In week 7, the rating and assessment process is a big focus when we talk to ECRU. And the law and regulations I will be showing you in tutorials in class, and you will need to be able to explore those and search through those to be able to identify what are our legal obligations when we work in ECEC. That National Quality Framework has been established under an applied law system, which is the national law and the national regulations from 2011 and 2012. They apply to most long day care, family daycare, outside of school hours care, and preschools and kindergartens in Australia. And it puts in place compulsory national standards and a quality rating system so that we can ensure that early childhood education and care is of high quality and is consistent across the country. The NQF also addresses 7 aspects of a high quality service, and these range from the features of the physical environment to the necessary staff to child ratios, staff qualifications, and as well as things like what should be in the educational program and how should it be delivered, and also what is the staff relationship like with the children. These national standards that we're going to look at shortly are supported for the first time by an early years learning framework as a result of the reforms over the past decade. And this outlines specific and key outcomes of what does it mean to be an effective early childhood program. So it's time now to take a closer look at what are those national quality standards, this particular component of the National Quality Framework. These are the standards that we look to and that we are held to account in terms of the rating and assessment process across the country. Many of you will already be familiar with these standards. You may already be working towards these or have met them, or hopefully even be exceeding in some of those in your employment or workplaces or practical experiences. If these are new to you, the way to sort of understand it is just to get your head around some of the language. So you can see in the darkest color, so quality area 1, scan down to the yellow, quality area 2, you can see that the biggest heading for each of those, so educational program in practice, children's health and safety, physical environment, etc., those are what we refer to as the quality areas. The lesser color, so the headings underneath the quality areas, are what we generally refer to as the standards. So when I am discussing quality area 5, for example, relationships with children, the standards among quality area 5 include 5.1 and 5.2. Underneath each standard, you'll notice there are some white elaborations, and those are referred to as the elements. So as long as you can get your head around the quality area, the standards, and then the elements, then you will sort of have a deeper understanding of what we're talking about when. For your second assignment, you will be assigned one of these quality areas and a couple of members in a group, and it will be your responsibility to do due diligence and research and unpack exactly what all of the elements and standards among your particular quality area mean, and to create that 30-minute presentation. We're going to talk a lot about that in tutorials, so you're going to have a little bit of time to actually work towards that goal as well in your tutorials. And certainly the semester break is going to be a really good time to be able to prepare that presentation. I would like to introduce you to a website called Starting Blocks, and it's an important website to know about as an early childhood professional because regardless of the ownership structure of an early childhood service, all parents in Australia have a right to rely on their system of care that they've chosen for their child. They also have a right to expect quality, and they need to be able to have clear and reliable information about the service that they have chosen. So, because we recognise families as the children's first and most important teachers, and under the new National Quality Framework and the laws, it does state that we have a collaborative partnership with families and communities. Now, this is an embedded quality, and it is one of the 7 elements of a quality and regulatory framework. So, on this particular website, on Starting Blocks, you can find information on different types of childcare. You can also find how to get assistance with the cost of childcare, and it will actually list the different costs of childcare in your vicinity. There's a database to find different childcare centres, and there's interactive maps, which we'll show you shortly. In many cases, you can also have a look at services vacancy and fee information and all other sorts of details linking to their websites if they have them individually. There's also some information too that I'd like you to explore because some of it can be a little bit surprising. So once again, please hit pause, fire up your browser and head to startingblocks.gov.au. Have a little look around. I'm going to talk about it a bit more on the next slide, but it's important that you can navigate it yourself as well. So I invite you to do that now. Hopefully you've managed to land on a website that looks something like what you can see on the screenshot on the left, the Starting Blocks website. I would just like to point out to you some of the information that's readily available once you start going for a bit of a search. Parents can load Starting Blocks. They can type in the suburb in which they live. They will get a list of the available centres and family daycares and other services of care. And they will have a price comparison. They will also be able to see very visibly the ratings, the most recent ratings of that particular service. One of the things I just want to highlight for you is that depending upon the map that loads and the way that it actually looks on your screen, there is a color code. If you can see down the bottom of that map there, those different little tags represent different levels of the rating service that comprises part of the National Quality Framework. So if you are a service that is not yet meeting the NQS or not yet meeting a particular standard, that will be known. This is public information. It's not a secret sort of system. There's a lot of transparency with this rating process. And in that way, it does empower parents to be really informed when they are choosing services. And they will be able to see which services are performing at a higher rate in their local area compared to others. So take some time now. If you haven't, I encourage you to take about 5 or 10 minutes and interact with the Starting Blocks website. Maybe pop in a known postcode, have a little look at some of the services that are available. Maybe just do a little mental price comparison. We'll talk about subsidies a little bit later. And I want you to consider, what impression does this website give parents? What impression does this website give current staff who are working in these centres or prospective staff who are looking to work in these centres? What sort of advantages does this website offer? If you also know any concerns, jot those down. We can bring them along to tutorial and have a little conversation about those. So again, if you need to hit pause, please explore, pop in a few postcodes of areas you're familiar with and just have a little look. So welcome back from the Starting Blocks website. Now that you've had a little bit of a practical play and had a look at how the rating system can be used in a public forum, such as a website for parents, it is actually also important that you understand how that rating process actually comes about. So every state and territory government across the country is responsible for its own legislation under which childcare services are licensed. So for Western Australia, we have the Department of Communities, and they have a subsection which is the Education and Care Regulatory Unit. You will hear me call it ECRU, and in week 7, we're going to have a lecture from some members of ECRU who are actually going to talk about that whole rating and assessment process. So that whole component of the National Quality Framework, that is that assessment service. The things that ECRU typically do, they are the people who approve and monitor education and care. So if a care service is seeking to become an approved care service, this is the department that they actually need to fulfill the obligations to. ECRU also assesses applications from provider approvals, from service approvals, and they also grant approvals for certified supervisors. They assess education and care services against the national quality standards that we looked at before. They support and promote continuous quality improvements in education and care service, which the rating system supports. They are also the body who investigates all incidents and complaints, and they monitor and enforce compliance. So when you hear of incidents of harm that have occurred in childcare centres, ECRU has been the department that has been investigating. And in the lecture, we will explore that in a little bit more detail. To continue our understanding of the current state of early childhood education and care in Western Australia, it is important that we understand exactly how big a workforce and how big a system we're really talking about here. When you have a look at that little table there, this comes from the most recent quarterly report snapshot that comes out of ASEQA. You can find these on the ASEQA website if you head to the report section and snapshots. You can see there that for Western Australia, we have a total of 1,497 approved services. The care-based is a larger proportion of that, with family daycare being a smaller subsection of that. Of the total available approved services across the nation, Western Australia actually represents only about 8 to 9%. New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland obviously dominate. They have a lot more children, and so certainly they take up a lot more of the percentage of the actual number of available centre-based places. We can also see that since sort of the early 2000s, children aged about 0 to 5, their attendance in approved childcare services hovered around about sort of 29%. As recently as 2022, that figure has jumped to about 40%, and I believe now we're in about the mid-40s. So the amount of children, the proportions of young children in early childhood actually attending approved services has really jumped in the past 2 decades. It's almost doubled. So there is a huge demand for early childhood education and care, particularly in that 0 to 5 cohort. In terms of the workforce in Western Australia, you can see the breakdown there of the different types of early childhood education and care services and what proportion of employees it actually employs in Western Australia. Of the national workforce, ECEC in WA, it represents a 7.5% employment figure. This data comes from the most recent census, which was in 2021. Obviously, in 2026, there will be another census, so these figures are subject to change within the next 18 months. The recent statistics for around about 21-22 show that Western Australian approved services that meet the NQS hovered around 65%. Those that exceeded the standard was about 17%, and so that leaves around 17% that we're working towards. Okay, so it's important we actually understand what those different types of care involve. So we're going to go through the 5 that you can see briefly, with the exception of in-home care, which is reasonably self-explanatory and typically exists for particular needs that children have or particular conditions that they require in-home care for, because attending one of the other services is not appropriate in their case. So the first and largest type of care that we're going to be exploring is what we typically call early learning care or early learning centres. Occasionally you will hear it called childcare centre or long day care. If you see LDC, it means long day care centre. I often try to avoid referring to them as daycare. We're not caring for days, we're caring for children. So an early learning centre seems to be certainly statistically is the most prosperous, but also the most populated option for parents in Australia. They do provide care for babies as young as 6 weeks old toddlers and preschoolers, and occasionally there are some places for primary school age children, depending on that service and their policies. These centres are open at least 8 hours a day. There are many that are open for longer. Many of them are open 5 days a week and closed on weekends, but this is usually round the clock all year. Obviously in Western Australia, we have a rather large fly in, fly out workforce. And so sometimes these early learning centres have even more diverse hours or more diverse sort of very early, very late options for parents and families, which is again one of the reasons why they are the most popular and most populous. Under the Education and Care Services National Law, so the law from 2012, these services must meet the EC regulations and the standards. They need to be staffed to meet staff to child ratios that are specified in the regulations. And an early childhood teacher is required in these long daycare and preschool services whenever there are 25 children or more. Sometimes new staff child to ratios include if there are birth to 24 months, it requires one staff member for four sort of babies, birth to 24 months. For the children that are 25 to 35 months in Western Australia, one staff member to 5 children. And those that are 3 years old, 3 at 36 months to school age, we have a ratio of 1 to 10. It's important to note those ratios differ across different jurisdictions and different states in Australia. These centres cater for much larger numbers of children than a family daycare can or than an OSH can. And certainly these centres require all carers to have current first aid qualifications. We are going to be discussing family daycare and other services for children shortly. Now, typically, but not always, in these early learning centres, children are usually separated into different age groups. So there may be a baby room, a toddler room, and a larger space for the older children, so that they have sort of dedicated safe play spaces with appropriate provocations and toys and, all of those sorts of things. They may also have primary school age children before and after school. Sometimes during school holidays, there's a different composition of children, and certainly on pupil free days as well. Sometimes they're next to OSHAs and things like that. Some of these operate as for-profit businesses and others are not-for-profit who may be managed by a committee of parents. Now, it's important to understand that the for-profit business model of long daycare centres is incredibly profitable business in Australia as the demand for childcare is so high. So it's really important that as staff who may be operating in these centres that we are ensuring that it's not necessarily just a business model, but it is a care model. It is a service provision model. And that can be tricky at times. And certainly something just to keep in mind about the nature of these different early learning centres, these long daycare centres. Another option for parents out there is something called family daycare. This is quite a different system. This is usually operates in the carer's own home and it is run as a business. Again, it must meet the same education care services regulations and standards. Carers usually care for babies and children that are below school age, although not always. Some carers may look after school age children before and after school again or during school holidays and certainly on pupil free days. There's usually only one carer. So what this means is that the number of children needs to be kept at a maximum of 7 children. And if the carer has their own children in the home, they are included in that number. There is a lot more opportunity for family daycare to be more flexible in terms of the hours of care. So this can sometimes be an option for parents who require perhaps a little bit more part-time, evenings, weekends, overnight. So in other words, family daycare is a really nice option for those that maybe don't necessarily feel as though a daycare centre or a childcare centre is the right fit for their family. Most carers are members of what's called a family daycare scheme, and so they have got access through that scheme membership to certain levels of training, professional development, support. Sometimes there's a toy library that they can exchange. There might be playgroup sessions for groups of carers and children. Family daycare coordinators do need to have a diploma level early childhood education and care qualification, and family day carers need to have or be working towards a Cert 3. Another category of care is called occasional care. Again, it must meet the Educational Care Services regulations and standards. Occasional care centres generally cater for infants to school-aged children. They're sometimes run by government or community-based organisations such as Communicare. They tend to provide more short-term care, and it can be regular or irregularly applied. The hours and the days of operation vary from service to service. So occasional care often sort of just meets a need in the community at the time it's needed, and it can actually be quite short term. And the final type of care we're going to talk about today, apart from in-home care that I mentioned before, is what we refer to as OSH, which is outside school hours care. Many of these are either attached to schools or attached to community centres. And again, as with all of the types of care, it must meet the regulations and the standards. OSHs are licensed to provide childcare for school-aged children from kindergarten up to age 12, which is why they are often on school grounds. And they also need to be staffed correctly to meet the staff-to-child ratios that are set out in those regulations. Often OSHs provide that before and after school care for primary aged children. They do run in school holidays. Sometimes vacation care is also OSH, and certainly on those pupil-free days that may fall when parents are still at work and need care for their children. Again, some centres for OSH operate as for-profit businesses, whereas others are managed by committees made up of parents or not-for-profit services. There are a really small number of outside school hours family daycare services, which sort of blends OSH and family daycare together. And they are sort of exclusively for school-aged children. So the My Time, Our Place framework is certainly what the OSH staff would be looking towards to be able to help provide really high quality service provision for that 5 to 12-year age children. Taking a closer look at the age and composition of children who are using these different types of care services and focusing specifically on the 0 to 5 cohort, you can see there that up until the age of 1, predominantly babies until they're 12 months old are not attending care, although some do. And usually that's because there has been some sort of maternity or paternity leave around about that 12-month period, or sometimes even more, so that babies can actually be cared for by their primary caregivers. By the time they hit 1 year old, 2 years old, 3 years old, you can see there that the proportion who attend formal care, which is sort of family daycare and early learning centres, has increased significantly. The reason why it drops a little bit again by the time they're 4 is because there's an increase in the proportion of 4 to 5-year-olds who are starting to make use of, I guess, kindergartens, and some of them might even be looking at transitioning into pre-primary environments and things like that. So there is a little bit of a dip there, but again, there's a mixture of formal and informal care for children across these ages. Informal care typically is sort of grandparents or aunties and families and uncles and all sorts of other different compositions there. What we can't see in this particular data is the age 5 to 12-year-olds and sort of their attendance by care. I can point you in the direction of some snapshots of that data when we're in tutorials. In 2022, there was represented about 3.5 out of every 5 children who were aged 0 to 4, so over 1 million children nationally, who usually attended some form of childcare. So this had increased by about 34% since the early 2000s, and the number is continuing to grow. And certainly in 2026, the census will give us the next iteration of data. On average, those children were spending about 26, almost 27 hours per week in some form of care. And please keep in mind that is an average number, which means many were more than that, and there was obviously some that were less. That represents around about 726,000 families, and the government is investing well over $25 billion over the coming years to be able to help provide some of that care. With so many children attending ECEC services, it's really important that these are of good quality. The evidence is clear that high quality early learning and care provides a strong base for children to receive the very best start in life. So, in terms of quality, the Australian government invested $73 million to implement that national quality framework so that we could lift the standard of care across the country. Currently, we have over 18,000 approved service providers that offer formal early childhood education and care. We're going to talk about cost in coming days. So, not all childcare centres and not all family daycare centres are equivalent in terms of their cost and certainly of the subsidies. It's just important to know that as of January 2026, the Australian Childcare Subsidy, sometimes called the CCS, is actually increasing. There has been offered by the Australian government a 3-day guarantee, which provides 72 hours, so 3 days, of subsidised care per fortnight for all eligible families. Now, what that often means is that there can be a subsidy of up to 90% of the fees of childcare, depending on income rates. So the more you earn, the more you pay. So, what is that eligibility for the CCS, the childcare subsidy? There is some recent government data on how many children attending care that you can see here on the screen. It's important to keep in mind this only includes children whose families have actually met the eligibility criteria of the childcare subsidy. So, parents must care for the child at least 2 nights per fortnight or have a 14% share of care. They also need to be liable for the childcare fees at an approved care service, and they have to meet residency requirements. Their child also must meet immunisation requirements and not be attending secondary school or be 13 and over. So this is obviously from 0 to 12. There are some exceptions that can apply. The amount of subsidy that families receive does include factors like their family income, how many children a family has, what age the children are, and the family's activity level, which means the income, and the type of care that a family uses. So, for most families, they do meet most of these eligibility requirements, and so the cost of childcare, while it does impact them, there is subsidies available from the government. Again, in making it wonderful that more children can access high quality care, but it does put pressure on the workforce and the demand to be able to meet this particular demand. Now that we've had a short look at some cost arrangements and subsidy arrangements for early childhood education and care, the potential for good services to improve early childhood outcomes can't be overstated, most importantly for disadvantaged children, because it means that if they are able to access high quality services, regardless of their ability to pay or their employment circumstances, and the provision of universal access for all children, then the outcomes of that are certainly meet the aspirations for the Australian parents and the Australian community. Participation in high quality ECEC services is particularly important for vulnerable children. So, for governments, an early intervention through the provision of early childhood services is a really important instrument for reducing the negative developmental impacts of disadvantage. It can disrupt patterns of poverty and inequality that begin in early childhood. There should be no Australian family prevented from accessing this system because of its cost. And it needs to be acknowledged that some parents really struggle in their parenting task and become overwhelmed. And the government then has a role to play by providing increased support for those parents and creating opportunities for their children to receive the best possible ECEC services. So my question then to you is, as a professional, pending professional moving into this industry, should all early learning care services be funded in the same way as formal schooling is? Why do you think that, or why do you not think that? And this is your opportunity just to hit pause and sit with your own thoughts about government spending, about early childhood access, universal access specifically. Just jot down a few of your notes, your opinions, your experiences, and maybe bring those along to class, and we'll hopefully get some time to share those. In 2009, the Productivity Commission sourced a report on paid parental leave and explored the support for parents with newborn children. What it found is that services need to be of high quality in order to have that remedial impact on children who may come from a poor developmental home environment. And it found second that children from positive home environments might be placed at risk if they experience poor quality care. Research shows that improving staff to child ratios makes a big difference in the quality of interactions with children. And it is these interactions that actually underwrites children's learning and development. So having good quality staff who are qualified through access to high quality training and education programs for pre-service early childhood educators like yourself studying at university is absolutely critical. It's really important not to ascend to a role of management that doesn't allow for these interactions with children, because this kind of defeats the purpose of all of these reforms. And Kian summarizes this about the debate whether or not childcare is good for children has already been thoroughly researched. It's been clearly established. Good quality childcare is beneficial for young children, and poor quality childcare is damaging. But defining quality has been an ongoing challenge for researchers, writers, and governments. And so in Australia, obviously, our national quality framework is our best effort to be able to help define what quality service provision in ECEC consists of. Internationally, research and experience suggests that the qualifications of ECEC staff is the most important determinant of quality, because there are clear links demonstrated between a higher proportion of qualified and experienced primary contact staff and correlated with a higher quality service. In 2006, nationally, 37% of primary contact staff at childcare services held no formal qualification. But in 2024, that figure has risen to 64.8%, and the remaining are working towards a Cert 3 or higher. We know that an early childhood teacher is required in long daycare and preschool services whenever there are 25 children or more, and regulations like that help ensure that highly trained and highly qualified professionals are actually present in a variety of different early childhood education and care services. But even with these changes, the present levels of qualified staff required under the new national standard still remain low by international standards. So given what we've just spoken about, this is your second opportunity to have a reflection before we move into our final topic for this lecture. The question I want to pose to you is, should all staff in early childhood education and care be qualified to at least a diploma level? What's the argument for that, or what's the argument against that? Take some time just to pause and reflect. Again, jot down some notes and bring those to class. Our final topic for this lecture today is helping us understand what the role of leadership is versus what our understanding of management is. Sometimes those two terms are conflated, or it may be that the title of the job in early childhood education and care may be something like director, and the job actually entails many management tasks as well as many leadership opportunities. One of the things that we're going to be distinguishing today is how do we know if we're talking about educational or pedagogical leadership, which is certainly the focus of this course, versus the still important and aspects of running a functioning daycare centre or a functioning family daycare that requires a lot of managerial administrative tasks too. It's important to know that many leaders have no formal training in leadership, but they still end up in leadership positions. Leadership emanates out of vision that is based in a philosophy, it's based in values and beliefs, and they in turn guide policies, they in turn guide day-to-day operations and where to innovate. It's manifested through planning that grows out of reflection. Management, however, is distinguished by active involvement in pedagogy, forming and maintaining positive relationships, effectively communicating and having high expectations for continuous growth in professionalism. Leadership can be formal or it can be informal. Often it's assigned to authority of others, such as a director or a coordinator or a principal or a manager. But informal can be taken on a leadership role. So you may be a group leader or a room leader. You might be a spokesperson or an advocate. Managers manage. They create stability. They make organizations run smoothly. In today's childcare centres, these are usually the directors of the centre. One of the most important roles of a manager is that of being a leader. So leadership in early childhood comes from numerous places. It doesn't just come from the nominated role of being the director. Leaders are about change. They promote change, they elicit change, they manifest change. They take on new initiatives and challenges, and sometimes the team of people that push best practice onto others are known as the leaders. You can be a leader without being the manager. You can fulfill many of those inspirational, visionary, educational functions of being a leader, and you may represent what the organization stands for without having any formal burdens of management. You can also be a manager without leading. You can monitor, control organizational activities, you can make decisions and allocate resources, but you may not necessarily be fulfilling the inspirational and educational functions of leadership. One way to understand leadership styles and how they influence an organization is to consider who controls the power and authority to make decisions, and how much support and involvement do employees have in that process of decision making. There are 4 basic styles described here on this slide. We're going to explore these during class, and it's important that you come to know what each of them are. An autocratic leadership style is someone who maintains full personal control over decision-making responsibilities. So they make the decisions, they don't consult with anybody, and everybody understands and is clear that they're the boss and what they say goes. There is a certain amount of sort of relief and understanding, and everybody knows where they stand in terms of an autocratic leadership style. But certainly there are some models for which that can be really difficult for people to work within because they don't feel like they're being heard. A consultative leadership style listens to the employees' suggestions and comments, but they know that they are still the person who makes the final decision. So there may be a period of discussion, there may be surveys, there may be open door listening. However, the decision is always made by that person who is still the director or the principal or the person at the top of the role. A participative leadership style takes the consultative to the next level in that there is a teamwork approach. Employees are not only encouraged to participate in the decision making, they're also responsible for problem solving. Sometimes this can be quite a lengthy approach. It can be wonderful, but it can also be quite a prolonged period, and sometimes employees can actually just want the leader to make a decision. So certainly there are many advantages and disadvantages. And the final one that we're looking at today is one called laissez-faire, which comes from that French phrase, which literally translates to let them do, or let it do, or let it be. And this is where leaders turn all of the decision-making responsibilities over to the employees. So they sort of absolve themselves of the responsibility and just kind of go with whatever the employees say. No doubt in your lifetime experience, you may have encountered leaders who either embody one of these or might sort of apply different styles for different aspects of their work. So maybe sometimes they are more consultative, whereas other times they're more autocratic. Become familiar with these 4 terms because we are going to be exploring these, and they will be informative for you for the final assessment. Some final key points to keep in mind when we start to consider the role of leadership. Many leaders have no formal training in leadership. So they may have been very competent educators and have ascended to roles of leadership and are still new to the actual journey of that new role because it is a different expertise. You can study leadership. There's a whole body of work. There's a whole research body available to you. Really successful leaders have many personal qualities or traits in common. But no single leadership style works effectively in every single situation. So you cannot be laissez-faire all the time. You cannot be autocratic all of the time. Part of a skill as being a leader is knowing what's appropriate when. Leadership styles do have a direct effect on employee performance and commitment, and certainly in some cases, welfare and retention. Leaders influence almost every functional operation within an organisation, from communication to innovation and certainly to team building. And we're going to explore some of those further in tutorial. Okay, well done. That's it for week 5. Just make sure when you are exploring the readings, the Cairns readings, you need to make sure you've got your hands on those texts by now, that you're looking for the chapters that are about leadership for this week. Thanks, everybody.